Alright, hello and welcome to part 2 in my video on Bruce Lee. Now, where I last left off, I was starting to talk a bit about Bruce Lee's movie career, the beginning of it, and how he got his part as Kato on the Green Hornet. However, I did leave out kind of a key thing that happened to Bruce Lee before that, and that was some of the actual fights that Bruce Lee had. Now, one of them involved a karate guy. And this fight you don't really hear about too much, but there were apparently a lot of witnesses to it. The fight lasted 11 seconds, and actually Bruce Lee ended up hurting the guy pretty bad. But, and that's one you don't really hear about. Now, the other one was his fight against Wong Jack Man, and that's the one that's most famous. That's the one where supposedly there's a movie coming out. I don't know if it came out already, called Birth of the Dragon, that is going to focus on this fight. However, Wong Jack Man was not a monk, and for some reason in this movie, Birth of the Dragon, they have him be a monk. But there's probably a number of other inaccuracies in this movie as well, so I don't know. But anyways, what had happened, and there's a number of different accounts as to why this happened, at least two that I'm aware of. The first one has to do with the fact that Bruce Lee was teaching non-Asian students. He was teaching whites, and he was teaching blacks and Hispanics as well. He was teaching them Kung Fu. And supposedly the Chinese didn't like this, so they decided to settle the issue by combat. And they got their best guy, Wong Jack Man, to fight Bruce Lee. Now, that's the one story you hear. Now, the other story that I've heard involving this had less to do with, whether or not, or who Bruce Lee could teach, but more to do kind of the way Bruce Lee was at the time. Because what had happened was Bruce Lee was giving a demonstration in San Francisco, and the demonstration went bad. It just went terrible. As a lot of comedians can tell you, sometimes a set could go bad and you could bomb on stage. Well, it's kind of what happened to Bruce Lee here. He was being booed, people were throwing stuff at him, and finally Bruce Lee got really mad and he grabbed the microphone and he said that he could beat any martial artist in San Francisco. And supposedly what had happened was an individual responded claiming that his friend Wong Jack Man could beat Bruce Lee. I believe the man's name was William Chen, and claimed his friend Wong Jack Man could beat Bruce Lee. So they set up a challenge match, and here again there's two different accounts as to what happened. The account that Bruce Lee, his wife Linda, and Bruce Lee's friend Jimmy Lee, who were witnesses there with Bruce Lee, the account that they gave was that the fight lasted about 3 minutes, and it ended with Wong Jack Man on the ground saying that he gave up. That's, one account. Now, Wong Jack Man and Wong Jack Man's friend account differs. They claim that the fight lasted almost a half hour, and that Bruce Lee came at Wong Jack Man really hard. Wong Jack Man thought that it was just going to be kind of a cordial sparring match, but he said that Bruce Lee came at him screaming with the intent to kill. And then Wong Jack Man got worried, and he wanted to restrain using his dangerous kicks because he felt that if he kicked Bruce Lee too hard, he'd probably injure him really badly, and Wong Jack Man would end up in jail. So he said that when he fought Bruce Lee, he used a lot of restraint, and then finally, after about 25 minutes or so, Bruce Lee just got too winded, and the fight essentially ended in a stalemate. That's Wong Jack Man's account. What actually happened, who knows? But what ultimately did happen is it did cause Bruce Lee to seriously re-examine his Kung Fu and to seriously make some changes to it. So, it obviously didn't go the way he wanted it to, and it lasted a lot longer than he wanted to do it to whatever happened. So he made a lot of changes, but he began to feel that traditional martial arts like Kung Fu had limitations, that you were definitely, limited in what you can do. And he began to see that with all the martial arts, that the martial arts were essentially limited by tradition, that it was tradition that limited the martial arts. In fact, there's a famous Bruce Lee quote that goes, "I respect tradition, but I don't want to be limited by it." There's a lot of times people can be limited by tradition and formalities, and it can limit people. And Bruce Lee felt that, particularly like the older generations, tended to be kind of more bound to that kind of thing, and he wanted to break away from that and have a system that didn't have those limitations put upon it. For example, if you did karate, you didn't do a lot of ground fighting. If you did judo, you didn't do kicking or punching. If you were a wrestler, same thing, you didn't do kicking or punching. So he wanted to come up with a system that didn't have those traditional limitations put upon it. So he came up with his new system, and in order to do so, he really studied pretty hard. He read like a lot of kinesiology books and was really interested. He was really interested in the economy of motion and movement, and how to because he felt Kung Fu had some wasted movements and motion to it. So when he came up with his style, which was called Jeet Kune Do, or the way of the intercepting fist, he did away with a lot of that wasted movement when he came up with his own art. And the idea was that, you would do whatever the situation called for. It was essentially a street combat system, and you would do whatever the situation called for and defeat your opponent in the most pragmatic, efficient way possible. The direct line, as I believe he called it. But, the direct line to defeating your opponent. Because like I said, he thought there was limitations in the traditional martial arts. In fact, one of his famous sayings involving Jeet Kune Do was, "Use what is useful to you, reject what is useless, and create what is uniquely your own." Now that is very artistic. I mean, that should be the motto of all artists. It really is. Use what is useful, reject what is useless, create what is what is uniquely your own. Should be the motto of all artists everywhere. And that was what he believed in. And like I said, it was called Jeet Kune Do. He began teaching Jeet Kune Do as well. Even came out with a book on it. Although I'm not sure, the book might have come out after he had died. But he did teach it. Now, I already mentioned he was giving a demonstration at the karate tournament. It was discovered by an individual, I said, named Jay Sebring. Now, one little thing I want to add to that I didn't mention before about Jay Sebring is the unusual thing about Jay Sebring is, well, like I said, he was a hairstylist. That's not unusual, but he was actually one of the people killed in the Manson murders. And, the whole issue about that, I had heard he was like a drug dealer, and that was why the Manson family went to the house they were at. I mean, there's some theory about that. And Tex Watson murdered Jay Sebring. And, Bruce Lee was really affected by the Manson murders because Jay Sebring was the man who discovered Bruce Lee. But, so some mentioned in the last video, he did get the role as Kato in The Green Hornet. And as I said before, Green Hornet didn't last too long. It lasted about one season. And there were some significant moments on it. There actually were some crossover episodes with the Green Hornet and Batman, believe it or not. In fact, there's even one episode where Kato and Robin actually had kind of a battle of the sidekicks, sort of. And apparently Robin was supposed to win the fight, Bruce Lee thought, no, there's no way Kato could lose to Robin, and no way. And I guess, believe it or not, the guy who played Robin was actually like, well, it would be appropriate to have me win. After all, I do have a black belt in martial arts. So it's just, he was saying this to Bruce Lee. But yes, but what eventually ended up happening was, I think it ended with, it ended up being like a draw between the two of them. And I think there were a couple other episodes too that were crossover between Green Hornet and Batman. But yeah, like I said, the series only lasted 1 year, and then Bruce Lee then got some other parts on some other TV shows, actually on a TV show called Longstreet. And it was on the TV show Longstreet where he kind of played himself, Bruce Lee. And he kind of shared some of his philosophy on that show. For example, he spoke about, water. That was a famous thing he said on Longstreet. He also said this on the Pierre Berton show, and that's, water, be like water, be formless and be formless and shapeless like water. You take water, you put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. You take water, you put it in a glass, it becomes the glass. You take water, you put it in a vase, it becomes the vase. Now, water can flow or it can crash. Be like water, my friend. That's a famous Bruce Lee quote right there. Not exactly word for word, but pretty close to what he did say. Now, so he said that on Longstreet. He then got some other acting parts as well on some other shows. But then what happened was he came up with an idea called The Warrior. And The Warrior was a TV show that he came up with. Eventually, the name was changed to Kung Fu. And the producers ended up going with not Bruce Lee, but David Carradine. Which, I don't know why they did that. It should have been Bruce Lee as Kwai Chai Caine in Kung Fu. Instead, they chose David Carradine, and yeah, there's really no reason for that. What happened was they were worried that an Asian star wouldn't be that bankable and that there wouldn't be an audience for it. So they wanted to go with David Carradine because they knew it wouldn't be risky. They didn't want to take a risk. Now, Hollywood, doesn't really take a whole lot of risks today. But, back then in Bruce Lee's era, they did take some more risks, but still, they weren't really willing to take a risk on Bruce Lee. And someone told Bruce Lee that, if you want to make it big, it would probably be best to go to Hong Kong, make some big movies, and then come back to America a big star. Now, it's very ironic because that's exactly what Jimi Hendrix did as well. There's some similarities between Bruce Lee and Jimi Hendrix that are kind of interesting. For one, they did both live in Seattle, but also they both had to go to another country. In the case of Jimi Hendrix, he had to go to England to become famous first. Then he came back to America, where he played at the Monterey Pop Festival in 1967, became a star. Well, Bruce Lee, it was the same thing. He had to go to Hong Kong and make movies to become a star. That was exactly what he did. Went over to Hong Kong and played in his first movie there. His first movie as an adult there. And that was The Big Boss. And The Big Boss is a massive commercial success all throughout Asia, and even, in the United States, it was pretty big. And believe it or not, the movie only cost not too much to make and made a lot of money. Bruce Lee only made about $7,000 on that film. So I think he made less than 1% of what the movie made. And then his movie after that was The Chinese Connection. The Chinese Connection, I think, is a great film. I mean, it really is. And that was also a very successful film as well. Even had his friend in it, an individual by the name of Bob Baker, played in that movie. And he played the Russian guy. I guess he was one of Bruce Lee's students, from what I understand. But, yeah, that movie was also very successful. And then his third movie, The Way of the Dragon, was a movie that he did that was shot in Italy, and it had Chuck Norris in it. Now, the interesting side note about that was the Chuck Norris character of Colt was actually supposed to be played by a karate champion by the name of Joe Louis. But apparently what had happened was Joe Louis and Bruce Lee had a falling out. And I should probably talk a little bit about Joe Louis here, because Joe Louis was a very famous karate guy. He got into movies and acting, but he never really became as famous as Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris. Although there are some movies out there that he acts in. But yeah, just never made it that famous. But he was a multi-time full contact karate champion and also a kickboxing champion a few times, from what I understand. And, you know, he became quite famous in the martial arts arena. In fact, if you've ever played the game Street Fighter 2, the character of Ken is actually based on Joe Louis. You know, because Joe Louis would frequently wear like a red gi and he had blonde hair. So that character is based upon Joe Louis. But, yeah, so Joe Louis was actually supposed to be the one to appear in the film Way of the Dragon. But like I said, they had a falling out. They were training partners. Joe Louis actually learned a lot from Bruce Lee, even though he was kind of hesitant to train with Bruce Lee at first, because Joe Louis is like 225 pounds, a big guy. Bruce Lee was, you know, never more than about 140, 145 pounds. So, you know, he was hesitant to train with Bruce Lee, but he ended up learning a ton from Bruce Lee, supposedly. But then they had a falling out, and it had something to do with the fact that Joe Louis's wife cut Bruce Lee's hair, and she claimed that Bruce Lee made a pass on her, which Bruce Lee denied and said wasn't true. But it created this kind of rift between the two of them, and they had a falling out. So then Bruce Lee casted Chuck Norris in The Way of the Dragon as the character Colt. And if you've seen the movie, you know, you've probably seen the famous scene in the arena between Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris. And that movie showcases Bruce Lee's philosophy on martial arts, because Chuck Norris represents the traditional martial artist, the traditional karate guy. He's very kind of stiff and rigid in his movements, is where Bruce Lee's more flowing, appears to be more agile. And in the beginning, Chuck Norris is winning because Bruce Lee isn't using his own style. He's using a traditional martial art. But then Bruce Lee, you know, becomes formless and shapeless and adapts. And